Now, this is out there by, and I'm going to be appropriately drinking from my Area 51 mug. I don't know if that's visible or not. It's going to drive me nuts. I can't remember where I bought this mug. I want to say it was in Roswell, but on my honeymoon, no less. But this is out there by Howard Blum, and this was published in, I believe, 1990, but let me just double check. And this is, again, one of those books that's a very mainstream treatment of the UFO subject. And I'll try to keep this fairly concise, but yes, 1990, copyright 1990 by Howard Blum. So this is, as it says on the cover, this is probably the longest winded cover I've ever seen. In the winter of 1987, following a series of puzzling events, 17 members of the U.S. intelligence community were summoned to the Pentagon. Their top secret mission to determine if there was life out there, by Howard Blum. So, interesting to fit. This is one of those things where I would love to graph this out on a big chart, a big wall-sized chart of timelines of different things happening in world events, and then see how some of these things all line up. Because this was around the same time as, and I think he mentions this in here, Linda Moulton Howe and several other kind of top researchers of the UFO phenomenon were all separately called in, and Air Force intelligence presented them with what they believed to be pretty compelling evidence of extraterrestrial life and visitation to Earth and that sort of thing. And there's a number of ways to look at it. They would show them these documents, and they would let them read them, but they wouldn't let them photograph them or photocopy or do anything like that, or even transcribe. They just looked at it and then they took it away from them. But they let them look at it for a long enough that they could get a good idea of the contents of these documents. And Howard Blum was one of these guys that was allowed kind of into that inner circle. So the weird thing was with all this was a lot of these guys were presented with this information, and then of course it was kind of pulled back, and they were told there's going to be this big UFO disclosure and this sort of thing, and then that didn't happen. And it's puzzling to see the exact purpose of this, because there's a number of ways you could look at it. Is this could be used to discredit a lot of these reporters, because then of course these guys, they're reporters, they're journalists, they're going to go out and talk about what they just saw. So you kind of have that boy that cried wolf syndrome, where these people go out and talk about what they saw, and then of course it doesn't happen, so they lose some of their credibility. Also, if they start talking about very particular, alien events and visitation to Air Force bases and things like that, but then the Air Force immediately denies it, it also makes them look kind of silly. There's that. There's also an element of that could be used to hide classified programs. So you have one. I'll take you through my three ideas of why this would be done. So one would be to discredit these reporters. If you have Linda Moulton Howe was one of the first kind of mainstream journalists to really attack the cattle mutilation problem and made a whole HBO special about it. So that's a good way to discredit people, is by giving them something that is like solid gold and then taking it back and then let them struggle through that. And the more they talk about it, the more ridiculous they sound. The other thing would be to hide classified programs. So by deliberately leaking something that is fiction, but it's very controlled fiction that's slightly different from what is actually happening in classified programs, you steer that attention. You take all the actual evidence, but you provide a different conclusion for that evidence. And I think there's some of that going on here, where there's some legitimate clues and pieces of the puzzle that before people are able to assemble them, you tell them that it actually makes a different picture. So you say, yes, there is X, Y, and Z evidence, but it actually points this direction, and then you send them off a an intellectual cliff that, where they can't get back. And then last but not least, you have a form of myth making, of kind of creating this mythology of alien visitation to the planet and things like that, and really seeding through journalists who have a good reputation, seeding this idea that there is this contact with alien life, but the Air Force just can't talk about it yet. This is such a hot button issue. It would destroy, like one of the arguments that keeps coming up is that this would destroy all religions, that this would basically knock down all the religions. And that part I find really interesting, because that particular angle dovetails with a lot of other plans have come out by like Sergei Monas that reported about Project Bluebeam and that sort of thing, about this idea that there was a plot to falsify an alien invasion to steer the public into a one world government, which that was one of those things. I remember when I first heard that back in the early 90s, I thought, man, that's crazy talk. And now the more I see, I don't know, that starts to make a lot more sense in light of what's happened over the last few years. But out there it's a good book, but it's one of those, if you're already a serious student of ufology and all, there's nothing in this that's really going to jump at you and surprise you. So that was a little frustrating, because a lot of this was like, okay, yeah, we already know that. Now, granted, in 1990, I got this book in like 2012 or 13 or so. But when this book came out in 1990, this was groundbreaking. So it's important to view it through that lens and remember that he was revealing a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that a lot of people didn't know about. I will end it with this, that this is not a book I would just run right out and get unless you are just a serious student and you want a complete collection of that. And if you're like me, you like to kind of track the progress of this information and how it was treated and by whom it was handled. The intro to this has a mention of the space fence, and I'll link to that at the end of this video. I recently did a little field trip to the space fence that's out by Lake Kickapoo. And he talks about that and its connection to NORAD and monitoring North American airspace. And one of the interesting things that he mentions there is that NORAD, he talks about, follows kind of this lady that goes in, this officer working at NORAD, and she descends into what he's called, I think, Box 9, on Christmas Eve in 1987, and to respond to some alert that's happened, and talks about her descending 2,500 feet in an elevator in NORAD. Now, that's interesting just because the public is given a very specific view of NORAD, a la, War Games, the movie War Games from 1983. Most people have an idea of what is in Cheyenne Mountain based on what they saw in War Games. And if that part of the book is correct, then NORAD, the Cheyenne Mountain facility, is way more sophisticated than what we have been led to believe. So that I found interesting. The other thing is, at the end of this, he has a pretty good discussion of Paul Benowitz and his entanglements with Bill Moore and the AFOSI out of Albuquerque. So that's interesting, that part, and this is probably the first mention of this in a mainstream publication. Paul's discovery of some of that secret activity and whatnot. So that part is of interest. So that's one of the sections I've got marked, is all this about Bill Moore and Paul Benowitz, and that whole saga is pretty well documented in this. So if for nothing else, that's valuable information. But like I said, a lot of this is already, if you're looking for new and exciting information or something that got overlooked, you're not going to necessarily find it here. It's more of historical import of just how that UFO information was entering the mainstream. Because this really, around 1990, early 90s was really kind of a tipping point where a lot of things like Roswell and a lot of the alien mythos by way of like Bob Lazar and people like that really entered into the mainstream and became more pop culture material than it had been in the past. So I'll leave it there, but that is Out There by Howard Blum. And at the end of this, I'll link to my video, my recent video from the Space Fence, and also to Richard Sauter's Underground Bases, because I find it interesting that his treatment of the NORAD facility at Cheyenne Mountain